Welcome, everyone. We're going to have a discussion about this latest research from Anthropic titled On the Biology of a Large Language Model. As is typical for us, we'll probably spend more than one session talking about this. And so today, we're going to start with the background material on not their findings with the LLMs, but the technique, the approach. How did they go about doing this research? Um, so what I thought I would do is I would start with a few slides covering the background on mechanistic interpretability research in general and what Anthropic has been doing. And then we can get into the techniques. And depending on how much interest there is, if you guys have a lot of questions, we'll take a little longer. If you don't have that as many questions, we can go through that faster and start talking about the actual specific results that they found, uh, primarily with the small Claude model, Claude Haiku.
How small is
Okay.
small?
Uh, I don't know. They don't disclose details about any of the Claude models to avoid uh, uh, whatever hackers kind of stuff. So they've never given any specifics,
Gotcha.
but it's it's not, Claude Sonnet is the one that everybody talks about when they're actually doing stuff usually.
Okay.
Um, Okay, some high level background. So if you go back to the distill circuits stuff that was published, that was actually 5 years ago now. And at the time, they were looking at CNNs, and they were able to say, we're going to perform an analysis where we decompose the model into smaller units. And we're going to study the individual units, we're going to study how they're connected, and this is akin to, like, you imagine an electrical circuit. You say, oh, look, there's a resistor here, and there's a whatever, a capacitor there, and there's sort of a wire between the two of them, and you can sort of identify subcomponents within an electrical circuit. So that's what they were hoping to accomplish, and actually wound up being quite successful. So this type of work has continued, um, expanding from CNNs now into transformers, but it's actually been a lot harder to understand what's happening in the transformer, so the going has been slower. So the biology of an LLM is Anthropic's latest work, and they're not the only ones doing mechanistic interpretability. They're not the only ones doing circuit work, but certainly they've had some of the biggest successes in interpretability. So really great to follow their work. So they had two small LLMs. One of them is Claude 3.5 Haiku. The other is just an unnamed transformer model that they trained that I think is even smaller than Haiku, that I believe they called their 18-layer transformer LLM. Um, so in the next few slides, I'm going to review background, and then we'll dive into the actual web page, which uh, if you know the background, it's actually quite readable. There's lots and lots of pictures, which often helps. Um, and so yeah. All right, so here's the timeline of the major publications. So for about a year, there was this distill circuits thread going on with individual releases. And again, this is where a lot of what we today would say is just the conventional wisdom about CNNs, that the lower layers identify smaller things like edges, and then vertical lines, horizontal lines. Middle will build that up into, patterns like circles, triangles, squares, textures, right? And then eventually, as you get higher and higher, you might have something that recognizes a face, a head, an arm, a leg, um, uh, and and so it's basically composing these lower level features into higher level features. In late 2021, this a mathematical framework for transformer circuits. Um, I'll call it a paper that, they release them on the web so that it has more interactive features than a PDF on archive could have. Um, uh, so this paper was breathtaking. They did some very good analysis, and we now have conventional wisdom about what exactly um, is happening in attention. Not that we know what all the attention patterns are, but just the way people describe uh, what attention is doing really came from this. And there's a lot of promise, a lot of excitement, like, wow, it's been a year since we did CNNs and we uncovered all this amazing stuff. Next thing you know, maybe we will understand LLMs. And mostly this research has all been on GPT style decoder only LLMs, as they are the most popular ones right now. So other people have researched things like BERT or whatever. This is basically, your llama, chat GPT, um, uh, DeepSeek, Quen, all these models are decoder only. Unfortunately, despite all that promise, we then kind of hit the wall, and it turns out that there's a lot of nonlinearities in an LLM. They're very big. They're actually much bigger than CNNs. Um, and it's very difficult to see the interplay between the attention layers and the MLP layers, and that the MLP layers, as simple as they are, were very difficult to understand. Each MLP layer is just um, uh, uh, two fully connected layers, to, right? And so it's very straightforward to describe, but to say how that is actually affecting things when you have 24, 36, 48 of them stacked, and the information that they're dealing with, keeps constantly changing. It turned out to be very difficult. So we have a series of papers where um, where the researchers were identifying, well, why is this so difficult? And one of the things that we'll cover in the next few slides is this idea of superposition, um, where we have more concepts that we're representing than we have dimensionality of our vector space, of our data space. Um, and so as soon as you have this, it gets complicated. You can detect these types of signals with compressed sensing, if any of you are familiar with that field. But we're not talking about just a single stationary thing that you can use compressed sensing on. It's now changing as you go through every layer of your LLM. And then you have a combination of attention layers changing your data, and you have MLP layers. And so eventually it took like sort of these three papers to like really prove like, hey, we feel strongly that this superposition stuff is real. Um, but that didn't really do much to help understand how the LLMs are actually computing things with these superimposed concepts. And so then that brings us to today, the on the biology of a large language model, where they've finally moved on past just simply understanding superimposed concepts and are now trying to say, okay, let's actually see how they're using them. Let's actually figure out some ways in which the LLM answers a particular prompt. Um, and so that's the very high level. I purposely skipped the details because I have them briefly on the next couple slides. But any questions before I go into a little bit more of the details of what did they actually find in the transformer circuits, and what did they find in the next three papers? Okay. So super briefly, I've been talking about it. I'm assuming most people are familiar, but so on the left is uh, a picture of the decoder portion from the Attention is All You Need paper, slightly rewritten. Okay, so we've eliminated the cross attention, which doesn't appear in a decoder only, and so then you really only have three layers. On the bottom, you have the attention layer, and then above that, you have the feed forward layer. And so what we're going to discuss is that these attention layers, their job is to have certain things that they're looking for and selectively match to earlier token positions. And they then move information to the current token position. So the classic example that I give is if you have a pronoun and you say, you know, she did blah, 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 you might have an attention head that will go and look back at the last 25, 30, however many words and say, what do I think she was referring to? Well, the subject of the previous sentence, right, was uh, Julie, whatever, lives in San Diego. And so I think that she now refers to Julie. And so we can copy information from Julie to the current token position so that when you're trying to complete the sentence after she, you know that you're talking about Julie. All right. We don't know what all these attention patterns are, but we do know that that's the general gist of it, is that it's copying information. Um, the MLP layers are not able to see earlier token positions. So even if we don't know what they do, we know that directly they can only process information within the current token position. Now, an MLP layer can process information from an earlier token position if attention brings it forward. So hypothetically, if attention brought information about Julie. So if the earlier sentence was Julie is a chef, and then she, okay, and then whatever, whatever, cooks might be a very reasonably likely next word after she, because we know that Julie is a chef. And so the MLP could do something to help promote cooks as the next token, but only after the fact that she is referring to our chef pulls that information into the current token position. Okay. So I'm being very high level and vague here, but just, want to make sure that when we're talking about these different layers, and today we'll be focused on just the MLP layers, but that people understand sort of those basics. All right. The other thing is there's a term that I don't know if it's ever been published as like a formal definition, but the concept of the residual stream. So the idea is that you stack multiple layers, right? 18, 24, 48 layers of these transformers. And left to right, we have the different token positions. So they're shared weights, but logically, you can think of every token position as being physically separate. So I've purposely drawn the layers to the side so that you can see this straight through connection. And so if every attention and every MLP layer output zeros, because this is a residual connection, then basically what would happen is once you embedded your token, that data would just flow straight through along this superhighway all the way to the next token prediction. Um, and I'm still not clear to what extent this is true, this is not true. Um, but effectively, you could expect that the initial embedding of a token contains basic bigram probabilities that say what the next most likely token is after each input token, such that basically, again, if you did nothing to modify it, if you output all zeros on all the layers, then you would immediately have a default next token prediction. Okay. I don't know if I can come up with a great example of two words that always go together. Um, I don't know.
Classic Harry Potter.
Eiffel, yeah, Harry Potter, Harry might have a really high probability for Potter. Eiffel might have a really high probability for Tower coming after it, something like that, right? And of course, there are also individual words that just the way the tokenizer is built, they require two tokens to make the word, right? So like if Barack is and Obama are two token words, then maybe there's a relatively high probability now when you see the first half that you'll uh, uh, but so the important concept is this idea that data lives on this residual stream. Okay. And the individual layers, two per uh, there's two individual layers per transformer layer. There's the attention and there's the MLP. But these individual layers are trying to add, subtract, twist, pull, push, tug, the information that's on here. And so don't take this too literally. But basically, what they can do is conceptually, they can add a unique concept to the residual stream. So on the residual stream, I have information that says San Diego, and I'm just going to add something now that's about fishing. And so now basically residual streams can have two concepts living on it, fishing and San Diego. um, you can delete something from the residual stream. So if fishing in San Diego on there and I don't want fishing anymore, I can basically um, take -1 times fishing, add that to the residual stream, and then I'll be left with just San Diego. And the other thing that you can do is you can nudge the residual stream. And so if the current next token most likely is cooks, okay, um, you can say, I want to increase the probability of the word lives instead of the word cooks. Um, and and so if you think lives is a very likely next word, you could sort of upvote that without necessarily disturbing everything else that's currently on the residual stream. Uh, the way I've described it, super high level, maybe I apologize. That might invite more questions than it answers anything for you. So if that's not helpful, then ignore that. But it's just very important for people to understand this idea that data is living on this residual stream, and that if you don't do anything to alter it, it will eventually lead to the next token prediction. That's the basic gist of it.
Hey, Ted,
All
can I
right.
ask a
Any
question?
questions? Yeah.
Yeah, a quick question on the prior slide. So, quite a long while ago, we did the Romeo paper where they identified,
Hmm.
I thought they identified like in the MLP is where information, where facts live. Um, and so I thought that was what the function of the MLP is, but you're saying here that they prove more difficult to I guess understand. Is there, are we going to learn what the other things that MLPs do, or
Yeah. So in the biology paper, we're going to see some very specific behaviors. Um, the MLPs, just to clarify, the MLPs are predominantly where facts live, but that
okay,
is not the only function of MLPs.
okay,
So, so yes. So your memory is correct about the Rome paper. It's just that's not the only thing they do.
gotcha.
Um, I have a question. Like, maybe it's that like everybody explains the attention, like the how each token is related to the other, every other token or word or whatever. But like, if that's the case, you only need it for the first layer, right? Not for the layers after that. But like, at each transformer output feeds into another attention. And is there like an intuition for that? I've been trying to think of one, but like I couldn't come up.
So I took a little bit of time to try and figure out what this green sentence should be. Okay. Um, Attention heads seem to have very complex purposes. Okay. But if we are a little bit reductive with it, okay, you could imagine that um, an attention head would have just one purpose, and that it would do that in a way that's like really, really obvious. Okay. And so in my example for pronouns, which is not, it's a made up example. It's not based on a real LLM. Um, then one possibility is that this attention head, what it would care about exclusively and nothing else, again, in my very simplified example, is the current word a pronoun? And if so, I'm going to score all previous tokens as being, well, let's just say um, nouns that are people. Okay, so maybe it is like a different attention head that does that. Okay, so for just in the English language, he, she type pronouns. Okay, um, my job is to pattern match anytime the current word is a pronoun against all previous nouns in my context. Okay. And when I do so, I'm going to bring certain information forward into the current token position. Um, Another classic example that they found in the transformer circuits paper was, in fact, it was from Harry Potter. Um, and if you know the story, Harry Potter, when he's not at the famous magic school, he lives with his relatives, and their last name is Dursley. So he has an uncle, Vernon Dursley, an aunt, what is it, Petunia Dursley, and a cousin, I forget his name. But so the word Dursley appears very often, and at the time when they were looking at, I don't remember which LLM, GPT-2 or something, Dursley required three tokens. It was a D, and then URS, ERS, and then Lee. And at the time, the Harry Potter was not quite so famous, and so Dursley was something where it didn't have its own token. I don't know if it ever will or not. But what they found was that if you see the capital D, then there's a relatively high probability that the next token will be ERS and the token after that will be Lee. And it's too expensive to devote an entire attention head to just looking for the word Dursley. So there was actually a more general pattern that then has to get combined with other things in order for it to do exactly this. And the general pattern was I will look for the previous time I saw my current token, which is the capital D. And I will bring forward information about whatever token appeared after the last time I saw myself. So in the case of capital D, it would look and say, have I seen capital D in the previous text? And if so, I'm going to copy information about not the capital D, but the token that came after it. And so that was ERS. And so basically, in that way, it's able to say, I'm going to upvote the probability of the next token being ERS generically without having to specifically know Harry Potter. It's simply saying that even if you wrote text that was gibberish that the LLM had never seen before, and so you made up a name that has never appeared in print anywhere, in a book, on the internet, anywhere. It's never appeared. But if you keep talking about that character as the subject of various sentences, then this particular attention head is going to say, oh, when I see the beginning of that name, I'm going to upvote whatever the token is, that's the second token in that name, simply because I've seen that pattern. Okay. Now it turns out that actually you need two attention layers to combine together to form this pattern. But nevertheless, that's the pattern that they found that was sort of this low level pattern. So they don't really know exactly when that gets invoked and how it get combined with other things, but it was crystal clear that these two work together to basically say, look for a previous occurrence of the current token and then copy information about not that token, but what came after it, because that's actually a super useful thing. Does that help?
Yeah, like it's like a really great explanation. Also, like it makes more like now that I think about it, like it probably makes more sense to have like a lot of different attention heads too, right? To make it easier for the model to understand all these relationships and stuff.
Yeah, yeah. And so it's unfortunately a little bit misleading what you talked about. The way people say, the tension is going to, I don't know, compare the words or some such phrase, right? It's really not directly about that because that would just be too expensive. You would need millions, billions of
Fuck
attention
me, you want to
heads.
fuck me? You want to fuck
Hey, there
me?
we go.
Come on, fuck me, boy. I'll fuck. Come on, cuz. Nghe bảo cư.
I always
I
wonder
guess
how
it's
much
time to
people
kick him
can,
out.
yeah.
Yeah.
I
That
always
was
wonder if
really
it's
good.
possible how much people would learn about machine learning while they're waiting for the opportunity to disrupt the meeting, you know? Um, So it's a little bit misleading to say that it's just about the relationship between the words. It's really about they have responsibilities for particular patterns, right? So whether it's pronoun antecedent or whether it's any token and the token that came after it in earlier in your context, or relationships between verbs and nouns, verbs and adverbs, adjectives and nouns, relationships between numbers, different things like that. So, and then of course, the reality is that they also are multiple job performing attention heads. So when the current token is a pronoun, it might actually match a certain pattern, but when the current token is a verb, it might do something different. And when the current token is a number, it might do another. So then even if we can sometimes see these patterns, you can't just say that attention head 4 only matches pronouns with nouns. It actually does a lot of different things. Okay, so I'm going to move on a little bit here. So one of the concepts that's important is the super important is the linear representation hypothesis. So when I talk about the residual stream, if you have an LLM and the residual stream is 4,000 floats, your model dimension is 4,000. People think of that residual stream as a 4,000 dimensional vector space. If you remember linear algebra, in the math, what they say is that basically then you can have at most a rank 4,000 matrix, a rank 4,000 uh, um, in terms of your dimensionality of that residual stream is 4,000. If you were going to represent things orthogonally, the way they're talked about in linear algebra, you can only have 4,000 unique directions in your basis. You cannot have 4,001. You can only have 4,000. Whether they're orthogonal or not, you can only have up to 4,000 in a basis before the 4,001st one is going to be just linearly dependent on all the previous basis vectors. Yeah, question?
I think I read a paper talking about the generalization of neural network. It says that it is not necessary you may kind of like have like a 4,000 vectors kind of like in way after you train your model, but they may actually be equivalent things. They're just kind of like equivalent vectors. So I think it was a paper discussing the converge it was discussing I think convergence of the neural network or kind of like the whether there's a kind of there's a more about optimal point of the neural network. So yeah. So I think even that we have kind of like 4,000 vectors and the at the end of the training results may kind of like converge to kind of like just one vector. Um Sorry, I mean
Okay.
not from my question well.
Well, I'm not sure what your question is. So you shared some of the information that you were reading about. Was there a specific
Yeah,
thing you wanted to ask about that?
I think I was reading about a paper talking about whether there's an or was it just whether there's just one optimal result of the training after the training, one optimal set of 4,000 vectors. So I think the answer the paper provides is that you may have kind of like multiple sets of kind of like the final optimal vectors training results, but they are actually equivalent. They think they prove it mathematically.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. In terms of deep neural networks in general, if you had from linear algebra a 4,000 dimensional vector space, you can rotate that around the origin infinitely many ways with
Yeah.
with 4,000 degrees of freedom, and they're basically identical solutions. So you certainly have those symmetries. There's a lot of research that also then looks at the fact that people believe there are um, many local minima that are not
Mm-hmm.
truly equivalent, and that they're just pure symmetries, but
Yeah, yeah,
that the loss is so similar that
yeah.
uh,
Yeah, I think
it's a
that's the
very good
one.
solution as well, right? So yes,
Mhm.
so you have the idea of a global minimum, but maybe you have, in addition to all of the symmetries of the global minimum, you may in fact have countlessly many local minima that are really, really close, very, very good. And that's why um, in this research, that's why people are able to consistently train neural networks and get good answers. You don't have to find the global minimum because even if you don't find it
Yeah, yeah.
and you wind up in some other one, you will wind up in a very, very, very good one. So,
Yeah, I think
um,
that's a paper, yeah.
yeah, if you look at like a
Thank you, Ted.
polynomial, if you have like a 10th degree polynomial, um, and you want to know what the global minimum is, it's possible that there's whatever 8, 9 local minima, that one of them is just way better than all the others, right? But if instead, you kind of think about like the surface of the moon, maybe there's like one really deep crater that is lower than all the other craters, and that's where your global minimum lives. But within that giant crater, there's medium-sized craters inside that crater, and there's also little craters inside of all the medium craters, right? And so maybe if the basin of that global minimum is very deep, there's actually multiple points that are all roughly approximately the same amount deep, but not one of them has to be the deepest, right? I guess there could be ties, but the idea being that, as long as you're in this case, it's a 2D surface, so the whole high dimensionality thing doesn't come into play. But the idea that there could be multiple um, minima that are, pretty similar in their results, if not actual, symmetries of each other. Right. So so if you think about this idea of the data living on the residual stream as a vector space, and if its dimensionality is 4,000, then what's going to happen is we're going to run into a problem as soon as we have more than 4,000 orthogonal concepts that we want to represent. And if you think about large language models, right? Animal, plant, mineral, I don't know, color, size, texture, mammal, fish, reptile, you know, we're going to be able to get past 4,000 in a heartbeat. Okay. There's how many topics are there in Wikipedia, right? Um, and and when they've done research, Claude doesn't even just know sort of pure concepts. It knows very specific things. It knows that there's this famous bridge called the Golden Gate Bridge. It knows that there's this famous building called the Space Needle in Seattle. It knows the Eiffel Tower. It knows the Pacific Ocean. So, like, if you even just listed all the geographic places it knows about, it's more than 4,000. All right. So that's what we're going to come up against in just a minute here. But the key thing to understand, and I heard somebody say this in another meeting I was in, I haven't actually seen this in print. So I thought, oh, this is actually a pretty important thing to include on the slide because otherwise I don't know where you're going to look this up and you're going to find this. To some people who are really good mathematicians, maybe this is just really obvious. Okay. But it was not as obvious to me. In the linear representation hypothesis, directions in the vector space represent concepts, but the magnitude of the vector does not mean anything. So if you are pointed northeast, and that represents whatever, how hot something is, or that something is hot, rather, I should say it better that way. Then a vector of magnitude 1, a vector of magnitude 2, a vector of magnitude 10, they all just mean yes, hot, okay? And any vector that's orthogonal to northeast um, would represent the absence of hot. But there is no real strong way in this linear representation hypothesis to have a really good sense of cold to warm to hot degrees of a concept. It's really kind of more of just a binary switch where if you match the concept, it's a yes. If you don't match the concept, it's a no.
So,
Maybe like, sorry, go ahead, Raj.
so I was going to ask the question. Obviously, the language models have to be able to represent degrees of stuff. And how does that happen then? Is that kind of some set of modifiers that make it a little
Uh,
hot or very hot?
I'm not sure. Um, Basically, so when I talk about matching a direction, what that means is then you take a dot product. Okay, so if
Yeah.
you want to, if northeast is hot, then you take a canonical northeast direction vector, and you do the
Mhm.
dot product between that northeast vector and your data vector. If you get a very non-zero number, then that means that hot is present. If you get a very close to zero number, and I don't know what very close is because there's some subtlety to it that we'll see, but
Yeah.
let's say below zero point 0.1, okay? That means not hot. It might be the case that if you're at zero point 0.3, then that represents a intermediate level of hotness. That's some hot, and so that might be warm, but there definitely is not the ability to say zero point 0.3 would be warm, zero point 0.5 would be very warm, zero point 0.6, you know what I mean? It is not that kind of calibrated scale. So I think my guess, and you might need to ask somebody who's uh, more well versed in this, is that you do get these sort of some or a lot. So it might not just be yes, no. It might be sort of yes, some, no, but it is definitely not a
Continuous.
numeric scale. So
Mhm.
when you think about like Euclidean geometry, when you think about physics and you say that the motion of a ball is a vector, absolutely, double the vector means it is moving twice as fast,
Yeah.
right? If it's a velocity vector. And you can calibrate and interpret the magnitude of that vector to mean something very specific. That is very much not the right intuition for the linear representation
Mhm.
hypothesis.
What about on the surface? I mean, if you have a lot of RMS norms, then there's no way really to do anything with radius, and so you would have to have your meaning directions be along the surface, and then you could have clusters, and so that if you move farther along the surface, then that could be hotter, that sort of thing.
So there's a hotter
Yeah, I don't
direction.
know.
Yeah, so there's a hot direction, and then for any group of things, if you shift them, and it's like a red shift, you can have like a red shift or a blue shift of a cluster on the surface of the hypersphere.
Yeah, and I suspect that there are probably a few concepts that are so important that they gain an orthogonal direction in this vector space, and that you can possibly decide you're going to measure rotation or magnitude, from this. But you really have to then like say whatever one 4,000th of all my representational power of all concepts in all language in multiple spoken languages I'm devoting to this one concept. It's that important to me. That is a huge sacrifice to say you're going to give up that much of your representational power in order to be able to do that. But yes, I suspect that there are a handful of things that really are that important.
And it could be just a local mapping, right? So you could have a cluster in a little neighborhood on the surface where directions mean, different things. And then as you go on the other side of the sphere, it could be a whole different labeling of the directions.
Yeah.
That's an interesting concept. I don't think that fits with the generic linear representation hypothesis, but the other thing that I'll say, it's not written on the slide. I don't think anybody believes that the linear representation hypothesis is 100% true. that it is the exclusive way in which information is represented. Okay. But it does seem to be the dominant representation form. And I believe one of the papers I was looking at recently just talked about something like if you have a dog or a face or whatever and you rotate it in 3D, it's sort of it's still the same. Um, but or it's not the same. You know what I mean? And so there are concepts that the LLMs seem to understand very well, and we would expect that they would work under certain rotations, certain other operations other than this linear representation hypothesis. And so maybe it depends on, like you're saying, in certain regions, or maybe there's certain a subset of the 4,000 that work differently, you know. But
Mhm.
by and large, this representation is there is a direction for the Eiffel Tower, there is a direction for the Golden Gate Bridge, and because of the nature of high dimensional spaces, um, even if you're not dedicating a truly orthogonal um, vector, you can have many, many directions that you pick that are super close to being orthogonal to each other. And so you can have many, many more than 4,000. You can have approximately e to the 4,000th power um, vectors in a 4,000 dimensional space that will not terribly interfere with each other when you take dot products because the non-zero magnitude is going to be below your epsilon threshold that it counts as a zero.
Julius, what you're saying makes a lot of sense to me in the sense that there are these different neighborhoods where directions could have potentially different meaning. So if I'm in a neighborhood of people like things, there's a gender direction I can move from king to queen or some son to daughter or something like that. But that same direction, if I'm in the car space, might be, faster or something like that, faster, slower. It's just a completely different part of
Yep.
or surface of this sphere, where the same direction can have different meaning. And that's Ted, I don't know if you're going to get to it, but that was one thing I remember you had said once before when you're talking about this kind of superposition. The, Part of the reason is that the space is so darn sparse that you can not, you wouldn't normally see these two combinations together. So that means that combination can represent something completely different, kind of the
Yeah,
sparsity
yeah,
of
and I
space.
mean even super simplicity, you could say that this direction is defined as the height if it's a person, how fast it is if it's a car, how tall it is if it's a tree,
Yeah,
and how sweet it is if it's a if it's an entree, a dish, right?
yeah.
You could just define it that way, and then they're not even regional differences. It's just defined that way, right?
Okay. I can
Right.
think of it
I don't
as
know.
regional
I don't know
differences,
how it
but
actually works. I'm just saying
yeah,
that, you know.
yeah.
So you could have four different directions that are all very similar that work in different regions, or you could just simply say, no, this is just one direction and it just means this for cars and it means something else for people.
Yeah. I'm gonna
I
go
don't know.
try subtracting king and queen and add it to Volkswagen.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Unfortunately, there's a lot of different nouns you can add it to see what it does, right? Okay. So we're still in the background. We haven't even gotten so I'm gonna keep going here, okay? But the important thing again to understand is we're using dot products. So don't think about magnitude, think about direction. Uh so in the toy models of superposition, we did discuss this, I think about a year ago. And so here's this idea that you can have e to the n almost orthogonal vectors in a high dimensional space. And I loved this particular chart from the paper. So they did an experiment where they had just a two-dimensional vector space. So we can see it. It's a piece of paper. We understand it. Okay. And they had five concepts that they wanted the very tiny LLM to represent in this two-dimensional space. And when there's no sparsity, when all five concepts appear relatively frequently, such that they're appearing. I don't remember the exact way the experiment was done. Appearing in the same sentence, appearing in the same paragraph. But so basically, if you had, again, I don't know, the Golden Gate Bridge and oak trees and baseball and whatever, if they're all appearing constantly, then basically, when you train the LLM with cross entropy loss, what it's going to do is it's going to say, I'm going to take the two most frequent of the five concepts, and I'm going to give them dedicated orthogonal directions, just like in linear algebra. And I'm going to lose the ability to represent those other three whatsoever. So I'm just picking baseball and oak trees, and the other three get lost. If you train it on passages where 80%, and I don't know the exact definition of sparsity, but 80% of the time, they don't appear in the same text. So if I actually used something that maybe conflicted between baseball and Golden Gate Bridge, then I have good odds that I won't run into a collision.
Mhm.
Then what they found in the LLM is that it would represent the top four most frequent concepts as the four compass directions. And you now have where you have this medium green and this yellow concept. They will totally collide. If they appear in the same sentence with roughly the same magnitude, they're going to cancel each other out, and you're going to lose them. So if you have whatever I said, baseball and Golden Gate Bridge in the same sentence, the LLM will just be like, what? What? I didn't hear anything. Okay. And the same thing for these two. But you still don't have to worry about baseball and oak trees interfering with each other, because these are still orthogonal to the other pair here. Okay. When they increase the sparsity even further, past 90%, where pretty much the concepts don't appear at the same time, then what the LLM does is it represents all five concepts as like a pentagon or a five-pointed star. And there's this issue shown by this dotted line here, that whenever you're measuring the baseball direction, if the Golden Gate Bridge is present, it's not going to give you a zero dot product, because if you look at this dotted line projection, you have this small component here, that the yellow direction will give a non-zero dot product. However, this is if your LLM sort of has an idea of a minimum threshold, okay, then basically you can tolerate a certain amount of this interference. All right. And so this maybe changes slightly your definition. When I was saying before, big dot product, maybe there's medium and very low, close to zero. Close to zero maybe isn't as close anymore in this kind of a representation. But nevertheless, you have the idea of big dot product, you're very close, or in some cases, these other things, have small ones that don't matter. So in this five-pointed star, you really don't ever want any of the four other concepts to appear in the same sentence, paragraph, or whatever, um, as each other, because any one of these other four will have different forms of interference where the dot product is going to be non-zero. All right. Any questions about that?
Ted, just thinking off the top of my head here, but in signal processing or electronic like transmission systems, if when we were using analog transmission lines, the longer the transmission is, you're accumulating noise along the way, and you can amplify the signal if it's attenuated, but you're amplifying the noise as well, and it keeps adding up more and more and more. But in a digital system, as that noise accumulates up to a certain threshold, you can essentially redigitize it, because there's this threshold. Is it a one or a zero, right? And I can eliminate the noise and reconstruct it and transmit it the next 100 miles, as a fresh signal that accumulates more noise. I do it over and over again. I'm just wondering, so this a view of the directions have meaning, but the magnitude doesn't, kind of would make it like that digital system, that it is it's binary. So I may get some interference when I add this pentagon, the fifth one, but
Mhm.
it's okay because if I treat it as a digital signal, I can eliminate that low level interference.
Yeah. Um, One of the things that's a little surprising to me is if you look at a large LLM that actually is fairly powerful and fairly accurate, um, when you look at the probabilities of the next token predictions, what you see is it does not look like 99% on one token and less than 1% on every other token,
Hmm.
even on really, really, really simple things. So
Okay.
if you say fact, 2 plus 2 equals, any LLM is going to have 4 being the most probable token. But I'd have to do this experiment, but I think you're going to find that it is not with 99% probability. It might even be below 90% probability,
Yeah.
right? It could even be below 80% probability. But they will all get it right in that it will for sure be the most probable token. But so when you talk about like, is there this sort of noise level? I'm beginning to develop an intuition that there's quite a high noise level that
Yeah.
the LLM is trained to ignore, to tolerate.
Yeah. 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 The thought occurred to me too is if you carry that digital analogy forward, what role do these nonlinearities play? Is that the part that reconstructs, that eliminates the things that are below the threshold, and lets the stronger signals still come through?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer. I don't know if there's research on this, but there there may be a need if you have a 60 layer transformer. There may be a little bit of a need for some portions of the LLM to be the noise suppressors.
Hmm. Yeah.
Um, there is another phenomenon that's very well known, which is that if all you care about is direction, um, when you start in your LLM in the earlier, the lower layers, people are whispering and they're saying different things about different directions and concepts. And as you move up in the LLM, the magnitude of the vectors keeps getting larger and larger, as if people are
Oh.
sort of like starting to talk louder. And then there is this one conventional wisdom that I don't know if this is accurate or not, but basically, I talked earlier about that you could delete a concept um, from the residual stream. Okay. So if you have San Diego and you have fishing, and they're both magnitude 5 vectors. Okay. If you add San Diego at a magnitude 100 to the residual stream, that fishing that's now length 5 has just become a rounding error. And you didn't have to explicitly delete it, it just went away. And
Mm.
so I don't know how much of it is LLMs just sort of talking louder and louder. It's like, you go to a party. Nobody goes to a party with the intent of like shouting at the person that they're talking to, but ultimately you have to do that in order to be heard, right? So how much of it is just it's doing that versus maybe there's some actual function that what you're talking about in terms of uh, by having it be not just an accident that people start shouting louder, but that like the volume might intentionally keep going higher as a way of noise suppression.
Mm.
And then we need RMS norm everywhere.
Yeah.
Also, if you think about images, the image world, it seems pretty clear. Think of the CNN original deep learning world. The first layer will find edges at various angles, and then the activations clean that up, right? So it starts out just dot products that are kind of large, for the various angles that are present. But then the neurons come in and say, okay, we're deciding these are the line segments that we have. And then you can go to the next layer and start putting them together. And so it's like this successive cleanup from the neural activations which is, I think, critical because if you don't have them, then it's all one big matrix, right? You just basically have one linear layer. And so the whole idea of a neural net seems to me is like I mean, it seemed like that was the idea that motivated them, the perceptron and beyond, that you're making a decision at various levels and cleaning it up, just like you were saying, Roger, just snapping to grid. It's like,
Mhm.
we're close enough to what we know that we're going to say that's what it is. We're going to run with
Right.
that. And it sort of cleans it up for as a foundation for the next layer of pattern recognition. You're trying to do patterns of patterns of patterns, and you really just can't do it without this sort of nonlinear decision at each level saying, let's just commit to this level of, snapping to grid.
Yeah,
Interesting.
that's definitely true in multi-layer perceptrons. Here we have a residual stream, and so the behavior has the potential to be slightly different because there is this idea that the signal can pass through unmodified, which it cannot do in an MLP.
But
I don't know enough to know.
I could see a
If you're
pattern
below
though that
threshold, though,
I could see a
in a
pattern
ReLU, you
though.
can be above
Sorry.
threshold and just go through linearly. All the ReLUs can just step out of the way. It's like a gating really. So you can get pixels floating all the way through, I think, unless I misunderstand something.
But even with just the residuals, I could see it where it could learn a pattern that says, if I want to insert a new concept onto the residual stream, it benefits me to not only insert the new concept, but also subtract to delete the thing that triggered the new concept.
Yeah.
That
Yeah,
cleanup that
and,
you're
and
saying.
and yeah, it's not clear to me how much that does or doesn't happen. And also, I uh Julius, I'm a little bit confused about normalization layers and exactly how they work and don't work. It is true that after we're done training a model and we run inference, that we see extremely large activations. We see very, very high magnitude vectors getting written to the residual stream. And the bigger the LLM is, the more we see this. And so, like, these are like exponentially larger activations. Okay. This is not like
Hmm.
double size or whatever. This is like, you know, this is where basically where like if you don't have very high like brain float or 32-bit floating point numbers, you you overflow the exponent of your floating point number. That's how huge they are.
Did I forget,
Okay.
is the norm, RMS norm or layer norm or something like that, are those in the residual stream or are those only on the little branches around?
Those are only on the outputs of layers. They're
So
they're,
there's
they're not
nothing
on the
that
residual stream
normalizes the
separately.
residual stream then.
The
Correct.
skip connection does not get normalized.
Okay.
Right.
What I've seen is most of what I've seen is RMS norm when you branch off of the residual stream. So just after your skip connection tap, you go into an RMS norm, and then you do your attention layers or RNNs on the normalized input, and then you come out
Yeah.
and add to the skip connection.
Yeah. I think there's an architecture where there may be one residual stream normalization just before unembedding, but
Okay.
that's probably not terribly interesting in terms of like you can't do that much calculation with just one at the very end, right? All right. For the sake of time, I'm going to keep going. Okay. Nope. Go ahead. Hand raised. Last question on this. Yes.
Yeah, so I definitely see this, the input signal going all the way to the output, right? But there's also the residuals that keep adding, that get added up in every layer. So isn't that like a important thing that's happening here? And
Oh, absolutely.
yeah.
Yes. But I'm not trying to imply that any large percentage of the time that the data goes through unmodified through all 18 layers. Okay. Um,
Hmm.
But it could.
I'm just saying as a mental model, it's probably useful to think of it in terms of that it could, and that these layers are it's more like they're whispering and pushing and pulling and tugging and rotating than it is um, if you were building a chip and you were building an adder, right? There's no voting going on here. If like if I want to carry a one, I freaking carry a one, and if I don't, I
Hmm.
don't, right? But this is much more of a you know, you're going down a long hallway, and at every open doorway, somebody's like whispering and maybe, you know, in some way, you know, laying hands on you and modifying things slightly so that by the time you get to
Right.
the end of it, you're like, wait, I walked in with like a white shirt and now there's like red splotches on it and there's other whatever and you know, I'm whatever. I don't know. I'm making up a weird analogy,
Right.
but
Right.
I think that
Yeah, I
that's a
mean,
helpful intuition.
yeah, I think the whisper is probably appropriate because these are all, residuals, right?
Right.
The name itself probably is like s- some little thing. So, okay.
Yep.
Yeah,
But
thanks. Yeah.
I'm surprised by your comment that it gets larger and larger magnitude as you go up the stack. It seems like
Yep.
that's a
It
bad
does.
thing. You're losing expressivity when it does that, when it falls out of a middle range.
Yeah, I
That's
was also
probably a sign that this idea of straight through doesn't happen very often because you can't if you need to get louder.
Yeah, but does it also mean that there should be some force pulling it back to reasonable residual stream amplitudes along the way? It cleaning up as Julia said, instead of just shouting louder, because eventually you can only shout so loud.
Well, because the residual stream, because the skip connection does not get normalized ever at all, it's the only way to bury the input.
Well,
So
two
if you
ways.
want to,
You two ways. Either delete it, subtract from it, or shout
yeah,
louder in it so it doesn't
Yeah.
matter.
Yeah.
right.
Yeah. I think that's a very interesting research question, and I don't have the answers. So I'm going to move on.
Okay.
Um, okay. So just in terms of terminology, this idea of you have an orthogonal basis direction completely dedicated to you, then that would be a and so then if your neuron, if this like if whether it's a person or something else was so important that it dedicated a concept to this, and every other direction, every other concept was orthogonal to this, um, then if you had a particular part um, of your neural network, if you had a neuron that was actually outputting whether or not this is a person, then that would be a monosemantic node where it's just basically doing this one concept and you can just easily measure this on off. But what we see instead, like with this pentagon example, is that not only are the concepts like this um, not orthogonal, not truly an orthogonal basis anymore, but we also see this phenomenon then where I'm not an expert in compressed sensing, but what it means then is that we need linear combinations of different nodes combining together in order to decode this in the compressed sensing, in order to decode this. And so each node is then going to be polysemantic, where they are going to represent multiple concepts at once. And it's this sort of, I don't know if constructive and destructive interference is the right exact terminology, but it's this interference when you combine the different nodes that what you wind up with is something very similar to just a pure clean signal. So when people do compressed sensing, that's what they do is they do like linear combinations of the inputs, and what pops out is sort of like, oh, I got a very close to a one here and a close to a zero everywhere else, and so I've now recovered my original signal. So that was our discussion of of directions and polysemanticity. I want to just do briefly background from the transformer circuits, where they looked at the attention layers and they said, hey, you know, attention shouldn't again, just in terms of like creating a mental model, I'm sure this is not 100% true, okay? But you shouldn't think of it as really calculating things. Its primary job is to move information from one token position to another token position and to put that information on the residual stream. Generally speaking, especially with multi-head attention, you can't write to the entire residual stream. So you're writing to a certain fraction of it. You're writing to a subspace of that residual stream. And if you know the way that the input and the output weight matrices work, you can sort of choose what subspace. So if you had, I'll do the math easier on me, if you had only four-way attention on a 4,000 residual stream, each attention head on the query and key calculations can only look at 1,000 of the 4,000 inputs or whatever, right? Or can have at most rank 1,000. And the output can have at most rank 1,000. But because you have an input matrix, it can be whatever 1,000 that you want. It could be weighted in whatever way and can be rotated and can be whatever. So you choose these subspaces. And then here's the idea that you should think about it as copying information from an earlier token position to the current token position. And then, of course, this can happen multiple times. So token position 5 can copy something from token position 2, and then later, token 10 can copy from token 5. So then it indirectly, 10 is actually copying from 2, but there's a hop that's in between. Okay. And the information that it's copying can be information from your prompt, from your input text, but it can also be information that the LLM has generated as intermediate concepts. Okay. And so I don't know what's an example. If you had a sentence and you were talking about San Francisco and you were talking about architecture and you mentioned bridge, it's entirely possible that intermediate layers, because we talked about Roger, the MLPs sort of have facts, they might surface Golden Gate Bridge and they might surface Transamerica Pyramid, and those might live in certain token positions. And later on, the current token position could decide that it wants to go and grab that information and pull it forward. And so if there were a sentence about famous landmarks in San Francisco, then the probability of Transamerica or Golden being the next token might suddenly go up an awful lot. All right. One other thing, which I'm just going to cover very briefly for the sake of time, is that we have query keys and values, and then sometimes the poor output matrix seems to kind of get lost. It's not as famous as the QK and the V matrices, but there are 4 weight matrices in an attention layer. And what they clarified in this mathematical framework paper is that the Q and the K matrices, they do their dot producty thing, and they set up an attention pattern that says, oh, token 10 is going to pay a lot of attention to token 5 and only token 5. Everything else is close to 0. The values that you get in your queries and your keys, it is impossible for them to in any way appear on the residual stream. The queries and keys cannot affect directly your next token prediction or even what concepts live on the residual stream. They can only affect which output values from your O matrix are going to get zeroed out and which ones are actually going to get written to your residual stream. So, so it's just important to understand that in most later research, what we're going to see is if you're trying to find attention patterns, you only care about the Q and the K, and you don't care about anything else. You don't care about OV, you don't care about the MLPs. If you care about information being represented on the residual stream, you completely don't care about the Q and the K. Okay? You care about the effect that the Q and the K have, but you don't directly care about the Q and the K at all. And so what we're going to see in this on the biology paper is that we're going to look at the pattern, the attention pattern. So it sums to 1. It's like a probability distribution, right? We're going to look at that probability distribution, but we're going to ignore the actual Q and K because to simplify life. We're going to ignore them. And it's safe to do so because the Q and the K itself never, whether you have a 1 or a 7 or a -2 in your Q's and K's and the way they dot, that 1 is never going to appear on the residual stream. That 7 is never going to appear on the residual stream. All they can do is affect your probability distribution. And so if you have the probability distribution, you then can ignore the Q and K whatsoever.
So,
All
Ted,
right. Yes.
does that also imply that at each layer, basically, the QK space is unique for that layer?
Yes. The QK space is unique by convention. If you have 16-way multi-headed attention, the space is 1/16 as big as your model dimension.
Right.
There is absolutely no requirement that that be the case. They live in their own completely independent world,
Each
and
one
it could
does.
be any size you wanted. I'm a little bit surprised that people haven't tried making smaller
Yeah.
QK spaces in order to speed up
Because you
the transformers to make them a little bit smaller and a little bit faster.
Kind of like the
or
MLA,
make it so
right?
that you can have more paths with the same size, either one. But yeah.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of like the MLA paper. Like if you can compress like a higher dimension information like
Yeah.
linearly into smaller dimension, like it would make sense to like just have the smaller dimension, right?
Yeah. So when we talked, I don't think you were here when we talked about uh the latent attention. It's like, oh, we compress this to smaller size. Well, why don't you just then build a smaller one? That seems like that'd be even more
Yeah.
efficient. I don't know. I'm guessing somebody has tried it, and there's a reason that we're not thinking of why this doesn't work.
I have like a
Um,
setup ready. I'll test it on like the small GPT-2 model and like I'll tell you guys next week what happened.
okay. Yeah, cool. All right. So, so having reviewed this, where does this take us in 2025 for setting the stage for this on the biology research? So, work on attention showed that its primary function is moving information between token positions. Concepts are represented by directions, and not the magnitude, but just the actual directions. Superposition and polysemanticity in LLMs mean that concepts are represented, are formed by linear combinations of neurons. Okay. In a CNN, you can have one filter that you say is the vertical line detector. It is not polysemantic. It is just boom, here's my vertical line detector. Okay. That's because you might have whatever, 500 filters, and you only need 500 low-level concepts. Vertical lines, horizontal lines, diagonal lines, dark, light, gray, texture, blah, blah, blah. Okay. Here we expect to have hundreds of millions, if not billions of concepts, and 4,096 just does not cut it. From compressed sensing, we know mathematically that there is the ability to recover these concepts. And since the LLM is being trained, if it's doing its own superposition, then simultaneously it can train its own compressed sensors to decode the information that it's putting into superposition. So this is not an adversarial relationship. This is actually this is a cooperative arrangement where the later layers can be trained together with the earlier layers that are actually encoding this information. So then I didn't talk about it too much, but we had a couple of these in-between papers the last couple of years where they built sparse autoencoders. And this is basically where, again, we look at linear combinations, okay? And then the way we train them is we try to encourage the outputs to be as sparse as possible, to have, if possible, a single one and a whole bunch of zeros. Okay. And in doing so, then we basically are doing this compressed sensing, and we're trying to find sort of unique concepts that we can represent monosemantically as combinations of our various inputs. And so these worked, and they were able to find millions of concepts living on the residual stream. And they were able to do some very basic experiments to demonstrate that these concepts seem to truly be concepts and not just a figment of the experimenter's imagination. So when they found the Golden Gate Bridge concept, okay, um, if they took a sentence that had nothing to do with the Golden Gate Bridge, but they took that one direction and they just did an experiment where they added it very loudly to the residual stream, okay, you could get something like, what is your favorite sandwich? And then the LM might respond something along the lines of, my favorite sandwich is peanut butter and jelly. I like to go to the Golden Gate Bridge and eat my sandwich there. It'll just find a way to insert that into whatever sentence that has absolutely nothing to do with the Golden Gate Bridge. Okay, so that was sort of their, and I'm summarizing it. That was the kind of experiment they did to prove that this isn't just us saying that this direction has some sort of meaning. It's by adding and by subtracting that signal, we were able to get it to stop talking about the Golden Gate Bridge, or we were able to get it to insert it into completely unrelated conversations. That's the kind of stuff that they did to show these really are directions. And if they recovered, I don't remember what the number was, 40 million different directions. I don't think they tested all 40 million of them, but clearly 40 million is way more than the model dimensionality. Okay, the residual stream might not have been 4,000, maybe it was 16,000, 32,000, whatever. But it was just it's many, many orders of magnitude more. So it's very clear from this work that we have non-orthogonal directions, and we were able to recover them using compressed sensing, using these sparse autoencoders. The problem was that even though they found the directions, they weren't really able to diagnose how these directions came about and how they were being used in later layers of the model. That's ultimately what they really wanted to do if you go back all the way to the first distill circuits publications. So this work is the first step to say, I not only want directions, but I want to know how they work to actually predict the next token. And so on the biology, the research they did was they said, hey, let's study everything, but it was too complicated. So let's gradually take things out of the equation. So what they did is they took the attention layers completely out of the equation in this research. This is only looking at the MLPs. There are many things that we will not be able to understand without including attention in the research. Nevertheless, there were a number of sentences that they show examples in this paper where they were able to see very specific patterns. And just to kind of give you a preview, one of the first one that they have in the paper is they have the prompt, I think it's fact, the capital of the state that Dallas is in is. And they were able to show that even though it doesn't appear in the sentence, the concept Texas, which they found from other sentences that have the word Texas in them, that concept Texas shows up right in the middle of the LLM. And then the concept capital shows up in the middle of the LLM. Well, that word is in the sentence. And that the combination of those two particular directions causes MLPs, they don't actually show you the numbers, but you have to kind of look at this very, very complex visualization. But then you can see, wow, that caused this MLP in layer 14, because those two were very strongly yeses. That caused this MLP in 14 to output Austin. I'm oversimplifying a little bit, but that's kind of where we're getting to, is to say not just directions, but what effect does a direction have on each MLP in terms of what it then spits out. So does that make sense in terms of like what we're now trying to do in this research?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we're out of time. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to do a super brief sneak preview. Basically, what they're going to do is they're going to take the LLM that has all of these different layers and they're going to build a replacement model. So the idea is that if you can somehow sparsify the actual signals, instead of having this 4,000 dimensional, highly hard to understand thing, if we can blow that up into 40 million unique directions, one for hot, one for red, one for person, one for animal, one for dog, one for rows, then it'll be much easier for us to interpret what the heck is going on in this model. All right. That replacement model, it turns out, is still too complex. Sorry, next slide. So how they do that, we're going to see is instead of a sparse autoencoder, it's going to be this transcoder that they use. And then this replacement model, it turned out, was not accurate enough and still too complex. So then ultimately what they built is what they called a local replacement model, which means instead of it being one model, the replacement model, there's just one of them. Okay. The local replacement model is one where they have particular values for a given input prompt. So the local replacement model for fact, the capital of the state that Dallas is in, is a different local model than for the prompt fact 39 plus 56 equals. Okay. Um, and so we'll get into the details of exactly how they do that. But they pull in what the attention patterns are, and they pull in errors from the transcoder that's trying to sparsify everything. And once they have this level of simplification, what ends up happening is that the sparsified components themselves are nonlinear, but the relationships between this new sparse replacement model is completely linear. So if you have an 18-layer model and it has just 18 layers that are linearly connected, you can just do the math. You can actually see how much influence layer one has on the ultimate next token prediction because you can just follow. Okay, once you've eliminated all the nonlinearities, so there's no normalization, there's no nonlinearities, there's no the attention is hard coded as a linear pattern, 0.9, 0.05, 0.02. Okay, so everything is just linear weights at this point, and so then you can very super fast directly calculate um, uh, how much how much anything is influencing any given layer or even the final next token prediction. Um, they then can do validation of the hypotheses that they come up with from this local replacement model. It's now so far from the original model, you could say, well, it's very dangerous to make any strong statements about how the LLM works because you're not looking at an LLM anymore. You're 3 steps removed. So then what they do is they go back to the original LLM that they built everything from, and they do some experiments on that. And so this is the thing where I say, like, if you have this hypothesis that the ACL ligament in my right knee is very strong and very important for vision, then if you cut my ACL, you might expect me to go blind. But if in fact what happens is I can see perfectly fine, but I have trouble walking, then your original hypothesis is probably not very good. If, however, you say the optic nerve is super important for vision, and when you cut that, I go blind, but I can do everything else. I can talk, I can type, I can walk, I can taste. Then that supports your hypothesis that because of the sensitivity and the specificity, that particular hypothesis is in fact accurate. So that's super fast overview of what we're going to get into next week in terms of the technique. And depending again on how long we spend on it, we can spend a lot of time in terms of really how do they build this replacement and these cross-layer transcoders, or we can go more quickly and say, okay, we don't care as much about how they do it. We just trust that, yeah, fine, they sparsified it. And let's talk about the interesting results that they were able to find.